fight is just a symptom. It's not the real problem. Because what is she telling us? They're not fighting about anything meaningful. But this is more about just that need that she's getting at. She's grappling with this. And I hope all of you can begin to understand this. This is about the need for chaos and conflict. It's not about the everyday vicissitudes of fights or meaningful, like lack of meaningful things that are irrelevant that you're fighting about. It's about a need to create stress and turbulence out of ordinary, everyday, distressing events. So in other words, life is distressing. Relationships can be difficult at times, but they don't have to turn into a festival of anguish. Hello, and welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today's episode is all about answering your burning questions. Many of you wanted to know about dealing with the chaos in your life and understanding the differences between borderline and narcissistic traits. I'll be responding to your questions, sharing tools, and exploring specific techniques that I have found helpful. Did our listeners find them effective when they tried these techniques? That's the question I want to address today. In a prior episode, we explored the intriguing concept of why certain individuals might be drawn to chaos. Your engaging questions and personal stories sparked a vibrant discussion that I would like to share with you today. And I'm eager to hear your feedback on this discussion that I had with listeners. But my hunch is their stories, experiences, and questions will resonate with many of you. But please let me know. Let's jump right in. I will paraphrase here, but in short, this listener was asking about certain individuals who are drawn to or who frequently create turmoil. This is what I discussed in a prior episode, interpersonal and inner turmoil, and why they plunge, I'm quoting here, into the depths of chaos and conflict. Why is it so hard to resist this temptation? That's the question. Let me answer this question with a very specific example. A mother emailed me about this, and I was communicating with her about her conversations with her daughter about joining a club. And she said, I over-explain things. I know I over-explain things. I over-explained the club thing more than once because I'm pretty big on safety. It went over her head, I guess. She blocks out my over-explanations of many things. I get it. I annoy myself too. I tried to get a little closer to her need to over-explain things. And this may resonate with you. This is what she said, that she often feels misunderstood, irrelevant, like a burden, unloved, and invisible. Like my feelings and experiences didn't even matter since I was younger, plus constant invalidation to the point of basically dismissing my experience as either not happening or accusing me of exaggerating things. That messed me up a lot. And it's a huge trigger for me to this day. So you see what happened here is as I explored with her own need to over-explain things, and by the way, the over-explaining things, you may have picked this up already, is part of the creating the conflict, the chaos, because admittedly, she said, she blocks me out. So her daughter, she knows, doesn't want to hear this, but she's compelled to do it anyway. And she also knows it's annoying because she said, I get it. I annoy myself too, meaning she knows that she annoys her daughter, but she can't stop. So why does she do this? And this woman has some insight, and she speaks about feeling misunderstood, irrelevant. And that's the reason that she creates this kind of conflict, right? Because she needs to be heard. So let me continue. In your recent video on YouTube, and by the way, folks, I just want to share with you that a lot of the content that you hear on this podcast, I also release on YouTube. So you may want to check that out. The main difference between the podcast and YouTube is just a little bit more dynamic. And sometimes those videos, the content there comes out prior to the content that I release in this podcast. Anyway, that was just a slight digression. In your recent video on YouTube, you said it's the addiction to chaos, volatility, drama for borderlines as opposed to supply for a narcissist as being the driving force behind their behaviors. Let me just briefly explain that. What this listener is getting at is I think I mentioned that the most important thing to the narcissist is the grandiose sense of self, the regulation of self-esteem. Okay, so she says, I believe when you say we have to go to the cause to get to the cure, and I think you all have heard me say this before, the mechanism of cause is the mechanism of cure. So we need to go to the cause. And just as a really basic example of what this means, to break it down, with the example that I just gave about this woman who over-explains things, so she creates a chaotic, conflictual situation between her and her daughter, where she annoys her daughter. But the problem is not the chaos. That's the most important thing I want to emphasize to all of you. What is the problem here? The problem is the feeling. That's the cause, right? This is what's causing the chaos. So what is it here? I think you know it already, but just in case, is what? That she does not feel heard. She feels invisible, unloved, etc. Okay, so if you think of any theories to possibly answer my questions, well, that was just a theory, by the way, right? That it's the underlying feelings that drive the chaotic, tumultuous situation. Could you also hypothesize some practical treatment approaches? And yes, that was a common question, and that's really what I'm trying to get at today. Treatment approaches, techniques, tools, what can we actually do to address the underlying cause of the manifest problem? Okay, and she says to treat these symptoms, right? Remember, the symptom is just the outcome of the problem. It's not the problem. So creating the chaotic situation in this example is not the problem. It's the outcome of the problem. Okay, so she just goes on to say she would like these tools to treat these symptoms. In a borderline, she's identifying herself as a borderline, seeking to sever and heal from a trauma bond with a narcissist. In my response, and I first acknowledge that her situation is undoubtedly complex. Navigating through the intricacies of a relationship with someone exhibiting covert narcissistic traits, while also managing the impact of her own well-being. She said she's borderline. This is not an easy task. Her close attention to the details of the episodes, the podcast episodes and the videos, I told her this. It demonstrates a profound engagement that is admirable. In other words, this is someone who really wants to learn and try to change her life. And then I told her, regarding your question about the addiction to chaos and volatility, it's a crucial aspect to address. And by the way, I'm just digressing here. Did you notice what came first in my response to this woman? I went through my response in detail so you could see, and maybe you could even borrow this. First, I acknowledged her situation and what she said. In other words, if you're in a relationship and something is escalating, or you're having a hard time relating, or you can't communicate effectively with your partner, first order of business. Remember, I've always said this. Appreciate the subjectively useful component. This is an example of it. I acknowledged her situation. And then I told her, recognizing if this is a pattern, that would be an important step towards understanding the force behind certain behaviors and breaking the cycle. I said it's worth exploring whether the addiction to chaos has been a recurring theme. In other words, I'm trying to open this up. You see so here, this is another technique or another tool, is trying to open up a little bit of space here to try to help her begin to think about, is it possible that this is not just about my covert narcissistic husband? I went on to say, Understanding these patterns can provide valuable insights into your own needs and preferences in relationships. I encourage you to revisit some of my earlier podcasts. Okay, so here I basically just told her to go back because in earlier episodes, I really laid out very clearly, sort of word for word, what one may say if they're in this kind of relationship. I had an episode on covert narcissism and working with paranoid narcissists. Okay, so her response to this email was, yes, capital YES. Chaos in my life has been as predictable and imminent as sneezing, as ubiquitous as water to a fish. She's quite creative. Your podcasts are helping me to identify when my motive in communicating with my husband becomes a drive to achieve the chaos, which I'm addicted. It's very difficult to achieve this metacognitive goal of introspective depth, especially when already upset, usually about a basic need going unmet. This is all a convoluted cycle that I cannot seem to jump out of, like the proverbial tractor tire rolling down the hill with a person inside on that Jackass show. Some of you may be familiar with that show. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but the metaphor is so rich, I get it. And I think you get it too. In other words, even though she can identify the drive to create conflict and chaos, when she gets caught up in this, she doesn't have that space that I was just mentioning a moment ago. And that's why creating that space is so important. When you don't have the space to think, yes, then you get into that cycle that she so nicely described. So my response to her was that a basic need going unmet, I picked up on that. And I said, but then what? You're asking. You have to keep in mind that the goal is not to jump out of that tire. In other words, the goal is not to get out of this conflictual relationship. Remember, this is what we're talking about, is the addiction to this, because this is not the problem. Remember, I mentioned this a few moments ago. You have to get to the problem. This is just a symptom. The chaos is the symptom. So I was telling her this is not the goal. So I said, but what do you imagine it would be like if you did not react to an unmet need? How would that feel? What would you do? How would you manage that feeling? These are just a few questions to think about. I asked her some other questions that she may want to consider. So that's part of my response. The second thing I said was how painful it is to discover, and I didn't say this to her actually, this is what I'm saying to all of you, but this is me just thinking further into her question, is that it's very painful to discover through an observation, in this case, a question I raised about the role of chaos and what role that played in her life, and her own recognition that this has been a part of her life, a big part of her life, ubiquitous. So not just with her husband. And as one begins to recognize that their use of emotionality is the realization of a wish for a state of mind that is the object of desire. That's what I spoke about, by the way, in the prior episode, which is the chaos recreates an affective state that's reminiscent of childhood. You may all remember that, but just in case, I did a little bit of review, and that's what I'm getting at here. And so, in short, what I'm saying to her is, it's possible. It's hard to jump off of this track to get out of this cycle because that's not the goal. If that was the goal, you could step away and try to create a little bit of space. But the fighting, the chaos, the turmoil, remember, this is all the smell of home. This is the affective state that's so familiar. And while not pleasant, remember I said that in the earlier episode, it's not pleasant. It does not make you happy, but it's gratifying. Okay, so let me keep going with this. So when in conflict with my husband, she says, I find it helpful to identify in my mind and sometimes verbally to him which of the narcissistic traits or methods or tools he's currently using, like gaslighting, projection, deflection, blame shifting, dissociating, etc. Do you have more useful suggestions during conflicts? I've learned to walk away and give up if he keeps on talking too quickly and anxiously for me to follow what he's saying. So, again, I hope this is resonating with many of you who are listening to this, because this is something that I oftentimes hear in my social media content review, is that one is likely to label a behavior or create a boundary. Don't worry, folks, I'm not going to go into boundaries today because you all know how I feel about that. But in short, typically, I always say if it works for you, great. And that's what I end up saying to her. But typically, walking away from somebody, hanging up the phone on them, this is not a solution to the problem. It may help at the moment, and if that's what you need to do, then go with it. But this is basically what I said to this woman, something very similar to what I'm saying to you. But I also said to her that you don't want to pathologize your husband. In other words, labeling him, like the tools that he's using, like that list that she gave, like gaslighting, projection, etc. I said, in my experience, I've seen how this further aggravates things. Maybe not even at the moment, by the way. On the surface, it may seem to quiet things down. But when you either label him or you walk away, the potential for communication breaks down. And the goal, at least in my humble opinion, is to facilitate communication. If he's talking too quickly and anxiously, why not become curious? What is happening with him at the moment? Is he struggling with something? Can you be of help to him? This is your husband, supposedly a man that you love, or at least once you loved. Maybe right now you don't feel like you love him, but this is someone that you once cared about. Why not try to help him? These are not conflicts about deep, meaningful things, about the relationship, she said. And I picked up on that too. Again, here I'm just responding to you. I didn't say this to her, but my thought was, exactly. This is exactly right. This supports the idea that I've been putting forward, that the fight is just a symptom. It's not the real problem. Because what is she telling us? They're not fighting about anything meaningful. But this is more about just that need that she's getting at. She's grappling with this. And I hope all of you can begin to understand this. This is about the need for chaos and conflict. It's not about the everyday vicissitudes of fights or meaningful, like lack of meaningful things, things that are irrelevant that you're fighting about. It's about a need to create stress and turbulence out of ordinary, everyday, distressing events. So, in other words, life is distressing. Relationships can be difficult at times, but they don't have to turn into a festival of anguish. And that's what she's saying. So, her response to this was, she basically had some questions about the use of the word pathologize. Remember, I said, you don't want to pathologize your husband. And she emphasized how important it is to label and to call out this kind of behavior, to not be silent. If he's diagnosed with NPD, is it still pathologizing him to take that into account? My response to that was, I can appreciate, I shared with her thoughtful reflection on the concept of pathologize. Diagnosing somebody with NPD and considering their behavior as pathological may be valid in a clinical context, but it's essential to strike a balance. And by the way, I'm digressing here. Even in a clinical context with my patients that I see, I don't even do that, by the way. I wouldn't even say that's clinically relevant to label somebody in this way and tell them these things. Focusing solely on defining behaviors can risk overlooking the impact labeling has on some individuals. In constructive discussions, it's crucial to address problematic behaviors without assigning blame to the person. This is just my opinion. And I appreciate, and I said this to her, and I'm saying this to all of you, that you may see this differently. But I find that healthy discussions prioritize understanding over labeling. And again, this is what I have found to be most helpful in terms of making a meaningful connection with somebody, maintaining empathy, while also addressing concerns. All of these things are critical. You could still address your husband's concerns if you get a little bit closer to what's making him so anxious that he's speaking quickly and that you need to leave the room. Okay, those are the tools that I'm suggesting. And I'm not sure how all of you are hearing this, but I just want to say a few days later, this woman responded to me. And I don't know how this was, I had no idea how this was going to be heard. So she says in a further email, I've been applying your methods and had some major breakthroughs. And here with all of you, I'm not going to go over all the details of her email. I'm going to paraphrase here. But she said basically there was a conflict with her husband that was brewing, and she knew he was projecting and all those other labels that I mentioned before. And then she said, instead of pointing that out to him as I usually do, I wanted to reassure him of X, whatever X was, the thing that was concerning him. Also, she said, I look back at at our emails and the notes that I took from your podcast, and I acknowledged, again, something that her husband was struggling with. Basically, she spoke to him. That's what I'm trying to communicate to all of you. And she said, I asked him, how does that make you feel? And this is where he responded differently, she wrote, than ever before. Ever was in all caps. In short, he told her that he was hurt and he felt rejected. And then she said, he has never, again, all caps, he has never communicated this openly. Well, guess what? I didn't say this to her. I hope she's listening. But you have never communicated this openly. I mean, this is amazing that you were able to have the courage to do something differently. You know, we get stuck in this sort of way of communicating, this way of relating. It becomes comfortable. That's the chaos. Remember, the smell of home. So this was a remarkably big step for this woman. She communicated differently, and he has never communicated this openly that he's felt hurt. So this is amazing. And this is what happens when you relate to someone instead of label somebody. Okay, so here's the next question. Here's an email I received that nicely captures some of the questions that I received around, and I'm quoting here, the difference between borderline devaluation, lashing out, and that related to another pathology. So here, I'll give you a very specific example of this, again, from an email that I received. I'm a little freaked out and confused about some of the content I've heard. Is borderline like a facet of narcissism? I guess that's what I'm wondering. In my response to her, I said, it's understandable that you're feeling concerned and confused about the overlap between narcissistic and borderline characteristics. I appreciate your openness in discussing this topic. It's important to note that while there may be some overlapping traits between narcissism and borderline, they are distinct personality disorders with unique characteristics. Now, I understand that not everybody may feel that way. And we could talk about this in more detail, perhaps in a later episode. If you're all interested, just let me know. But what I told this woman was that narcissistic personality disorder typically is characterized by what? You've all heard me say this many times over in prior episodes. The grandiose sense of self. That's the defining and core characteristic. It's a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy. Individuals who have narcissistic characteristics often have an exaggerated sense of self-importance. And more often, this is really a critical piece that I think goes overlooked in the social media content. More often than not, depending on the type of, remember, there are different clusters and types of narcissism, but more often than not, there's an aloofness. I've called this an affective block. In other words, there's a certain distance that they create, a certain lack of connection. On the other hand, individuals with borderline personality characteristics are typically characterized by instability in mood, self-image, and interpersonal relationships. In other words, people with borderline characteristics experience intense and rapidly changing emotions. One minute they could be laughing, And another moment they could be angry, then they could shift to crying, and then they're back to laughing again. I don't know if you've ever seen this. I've certainly been down this road before with many patients. So that's what I mean by rapidly changing emotions. You do not see that. You typically do not see that in most of the clusters with individuals with narcissistic characteristics, because a stabilizing factor or structure within them is the grandiose sense of self. There's an intense fear. Again, I'm back to the borderline characteristics. The most prevalent, or the most, what's at the core, is there's an intense fear of abandonment, and there's difficulty forming and maintaining stable relationships. I emphasize the word stable because they can actually form relationships, and they may have relationships that last for years and decades, but these typically are not stable relationships. So, as I said a moment ago, more often than not, with the people who have narcissistic characteristics, there's a general sense of aloofness. Conversely, if someone has borderline characteristics, more often than not, there are really intense, highly conflictual involvements. Okay, so that leads us into another question then, is if we're thinking about these really intense involvements, this question came up and I thought it fit in here nicely. Why is there a need for quick, intense, and demanding, I think they called it clinging involvement? Does this mean I have BPD? This is certainly one of the characteristics of borderline personality disorder. And it may look something like this. I want to just describe like the quick, intense, demanding, clinging involvement. Do you or someone you know tend to overshare or give too much personal information too quickly? That's the most critical piece, too quickly, early on in a relationship. In the first days, do you flood them or do they flood you with a lot of personal, oftentimes traumatic or painful information? Do you get upset when someone does not respond to you quickly enough? And I see a lot of this today, by the way, with text messaging. And I also see how manipulative one can become when they are so quick to conclude and feel like they've been abandoned, completely abandoned, or cut off when they don't receive a quick or thorough enough response. So the quick and clinging involvement with others is often generated by an intense need in which the others are related to as a need gratifying object. And you've heard me say this before, and I won't go into it again today. Check out my earlier episodes on part object relationships. This quick clinging involvement, again, like an example of this, it could look like this. The feeling is one of, he will take care of me. He completely understands me. I feel so safe with him. I feel so protected. I can trust him. And this is the part again I'm emphasizing, happens so quickly, and that accounts for the intensity as well. The intensity of such needs and the clinging to these individuals. This is all a source of gratification. And while it can vary considerably in intensity and degree, but these relationships that I'm describing, they almost always heat up very quickly. And that's the difference, by the way. If I'm distinguishing between those with narcissistic characteristics and borderline characteristics, with the narcissist, we all know there's that love bombing phase. I've discussed this in prior episodes. But what's the difference? If it's in someone who's predominantly organized in a narcissistic way, this does not take on the same intensity as with someone who has these borderline characteristics. Okay, so the oversharing that I mentioned earlier with an idealized image, remember, he's going to take care of me, I trust him. This is what one has in mind. And just as an aside, they don't know that they're idealizing the other person. Like if you told them this, and I don't recommend you do, because again, that's the whole labeling thing, but they would think you're crazy because they really believe that the other person, again, soon after meeting them, is amazing, is great, is the best, is so trustworthy, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a general feeling, though, and this is why this exists. Remember the cost leads to the cure. So we always need to understand what's going on beyond this. There's a general feeling of emptiness and intense hunger inside of these individuals. Or, as I mentioned earlier, in the example that I gave when I explored the need for her to over-explain, they have never felt heard, and they don't feel like they matter, or like they don't feel like they have anything to offer. So then, of course, if this is a feeling that they're carrying around, it makes it a little bit more understandable why they have these intense wishes to be taken care of, to be nurtured, to be heard, to over-explain things. It makes complete sense. Okay. And when these demands are not met, I'm just sort of following the trajectory of what typically happens here in these relationships. When such demands are not met, as they might not well be, right? Because why? Because first of all, there's this emptiness inside of them and this intense hunger. So there are excessive expectations, which are almost impossible to meet, or the inability of the other person to meet them, not just because they're excessive, but because they get hooked up, like in that example I gave earlier, with a covert narcissist. A covert narcissist is only trying to figure out how can he get you to meet his needs. So he can't meet these needs. He can't respond. Or finally, well, not finally, I'm sure there are many other reasons, but one other reasons that their demands are not met is because after this initial period of this really intense phase, the beginning of this relationship, the idealization, the other person just needs to get back to work, get back to life, do something, do anything. It doesn't matter what they do, because whatever they do, they are separate from you. They are no longer in this merged, idealized, idyllic relationship with you. And then that creates a problem because now there are massive feelings of desperation, which tend to mask, by the way, intense rage that will eventually rear its head. But initially, it comes out as desperation. And again, here's the distinguishing piece. Like, you don't typically see this level of desperation, neediness, clinginess with most of the clusters of narcissism. Maybe the lower functioning narcissists that get closer to the borderline in terms of, like, I spoke about the craving in the literature, that the social media content call it the covert narcissist. In my field, the psychoanalysis, we call it the craving narcissist. But now you could see why we call it the craving narcissist, because they're so hungry, they're so desperate. And these massive feelings of desperation when somebody separates from them, when they're not there, take over. And what gets mobilized are really destructive impulses that are closely associated with rage. And you know, in earlier episodes, I've distinguished between anger, rage, and hatred. And this is an intense form of rage that gets expressed in many different ways, which we cannot discuss today, unfortunately, because we have to begin to wrap things up. I will say just one quick word about it in terms of how this rage gets expressed. There's this old saying that with someone who has borderline characteristics, that they're either at your throat or at your feet. And that's basically what I was just trying to demonstrate to all of you, which is this rage either comes out when they're at your throat, which is assertively, aggressively, that they're attacking, devaluing you, right? Making you seem like you failed them, that you've hurt them so badly. That's the rage. Or they're at your feet. That's the desperation that I was just mentioning and the idealization. So here's a perfect example that I received from one more podcast listener that I will conclude this episode with your words, okay? This is in terms of how the rage gets expressed. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but perhaps this will resonate with you. I think I do have a lot of anger. I think that I'm not really in touch with, but it comes out differently, or I over control it and hold it in. Not always, because, I can be kind of fierce. You see, that's what I was just describing. Either it gets held in and it can be directed against oneself. I'm a loser. I'm a failure. I overwhelm somebody. I'm so desperate, etc. Or I could be fierce. That's when they're at your throat. I'm going to go on. I usually shut down or distance myself from people instead. Don't get me wrong. I do defend myself if I feel attacked and someone pushes me to the breaking point, and I can become almost like a complete psychopath. Anyway, I hope you have found this Q&A, right? This is really like question and answer time. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope it's giving you a clearer sense of how I think about issues such as chaos, inner turmoil, and the differences between narcissistic and borderline characteristics. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you who submitted questions and bravely shared your personal stories. It takes immense courage to open up and be vulnerable, and I truly appreciate the trust that you've placed in me and in the Narcissism Decoder podcast community. I encourage you to keep the questions coming. I'll do my best to respond directly and perhaps pick them up like I did today in a future podcast episode. Maybe even, I'm thinking about this, and I would love your feedback, maybe even a live stream at some point. Write to me and let me know. Let me know what you think about a live stream. We could do this more directly if that's possible. I'm not sure. I'm just thinking out loud here, but I would love your feedback. Keep in touch. We have to hold off there for now. But until next time, as always, engage your mind, not your weapon. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.